Welcome back to the Blazor Server In-Depth course. In this lesson, we're looking at parameters and how we can send data to a Razor component so that our Blazor server page can be a little more dynamic in how it uses components. All right, so let's go to Visual Studio and we'll create a new project, a new Blazor app. We'll call it Blazor app and the solution name will be Parameters Demo. All right, Blazor server app.NET Core 3.1, HTTPS, hit create. And now from this, what we're going to do is we're going to let's create a new page, again for components. So let's create a new item, a Razor component, and let's just call it components, plural. Hit add. And in here, what we'll do is we are going to have that counter component again, like so. But we don't want that counter component to start at 0. This page wants it to start from a different value. So how do we send information to this counter to say, hey, start at a different value? Well, the way to do that is to go to the counter page, or the counter component is where I'm using it now. Let's create a property. And we'll call this starting value. And we're going to decorate this with parameter. So we're telling C# and telling Blazor, hey, this right here is a parameter that you send in. And now what we're going to do is we're going to do that protected override on the onParameter set. Now again, I would use the async version if I was doing anything where I was talking to the database or something else, but I'm not. I'm just going to be setting a value. So current count equals starting value. So there's no reason for async here. It actually would slow things down a little bit. So I'm going to use the regular version, and I'm going to set the starting value equal to the current count. Now I'm doing that on parameter set because that's a parameter. So therefore I have to wait for it to be set before I can then use the value. So when this gets set, I am going to change the current count, the starter count, to be the starting value. Now if no parameters passed in, then it will be the default, which is 0. All right, so now over here on Razor my components page, let's get rid of code. How do I send a value to this counter component? Well, we just put inside the opening tag, starting value equals 5. So now this is a parameter on my counter control because I said it's a parameter. It's really as simple as that. So now I have this components. We're not going to put it in the menu. We'll just go /components to go there. I may in a minute make my life easier, and your life, but components. Well, it makes my life even easier if I actually give us a page directive. And since we're already making our lives a little easier, let's just do the rest of the thing. And we're going to add the navigation. It's not hard to add navigation. Components, as long as you spell it right. And again, change the icon, just make it different. And again, we'll do the icon roulette. Wait for a little bit, wait for it, wait for it. Map marker. Okay. So now we have our application set up with a navigation item for us, components, and there we go. Notice the current count, or the current count is 5. So that's the starter value, even though by default it would be 0. So we're passing in a parameter. We can do that with multiple parameters if we want. For example, let's change this a little more. So instead of saying this is the counter page, maybe pass in the header, what this page actually is. So we'd say something like, well, let's create the variable first. Private string page header equals counter. So by default, it'll be the same value as before. I'm just going to say at page header to bring that text into this spot. But we can make a parameter that is going to be string, and this will be page header, capital P. And then on parameter set, we can say if string.is parameters. Now, what this allows us to do, let's just copy this and I'll paste it again. This one's going to start at 21, and this is the driving responsibly. I don't know. I just put words at this point. But now there's two counters here. And you know what? Let's break these apart by actually, I'm going to cut this out. I'm going to say div class equals row. And then in here, I'm going to say div class equals call dash 6. And I'll paste that in. I'm going to cut this out. And I'm going to do the same thing. Div class equals call dash 6. And paste this one in. Just to show you can move these around the page and align them nicely or do other things like that. So we'll run this and we'll see how we do. Again, nothing has changed on the counter itself. We go to components. Now we have two different components here, side by side. One's a new type of counter that starts at 5, and one's a driving responsibly that starts at 21, although probably we should put it up around 28 for people driving responsibly. Maybe 34. So that allows us to compose these components and send data so that you don't have the identical thing on the page multiple times. You might have multiple different components that might be of value. For example, you might have a restaurant, and so you create a small component that has the image of the dish, the title of the dish, the cost of the dish, the ingredients, and a small description. Well, if you make that generic and then just pass in the different values from the database, you could have a whole page full of those components. And they'll all be different because it's each for a different dish that you serve. And so with just a little bit of work with a Razor component, you now have the ability to have these very different things, but on the same page and just pulling from a database. Another example is maybe you take this weather forecast data and you change it. I mean, who really looks at a weather forecast like this? Usually you have those little blocks where this is today, this is tomorrow, and so on down the list. Well, you could take all this information here and create a little block where it says, it shows cooler, has an icon, it has the low and the high, or just the temperature, I guess is all we have here, and the date. And then have another one for the next date, and the next date, and the next date, and you can loop through those. So there's a lot of stuff you can do where you can pass in these values, and it really makes these things flexible. So that's really it for this lesson. We're using our components and we're passing in parameters. And those parameters are just declared in our code of the component that we're using. So we declare the parameter, we can use it this way, and then because of that, we can have two different looking outputs for the same component. And that's based upon using those parameters to tweak what we see. All right, so give that a practice, try it out, create a few different components and pass in different parameters. And then we come back in the next lesson, we're going to look at actually passing components as one of our parameters.